Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today I have with me a dear guest of mine, Dr. Yakoob Ahmed. He's a PhD graduate of the Department of Languages and Cultures, School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He also graduated from the same institution with a master's degree in Near and Middle East Studies with a focus on Ottoman history and Turkish politics. His research focuses are late Ottoman history, Muslim intellectual thought in the 19th and 20th centuries, Islamic constitutionalism, nation-state construction, ulema history of the late Ottoman state, identity and collective memory construction. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you, Doctor?
Warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing good within reason. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. So without further ado, it's been a long-awaited episode. We'll get right to it. So the first question I have for you is, if you could travel back to any time period in Ottoman history, which one would you travel to and why?
Oh wow, that's a fantastic question. I don't know if I have a single moment that I want to travel back in time in. I think there are multiple moments that I would love to have been a fly on the wall. I mean, so for example, I would be really fascinated in just simply when Bayezid the Yildirim, they call him the Thunderbolt, went to war with Timurlane. And I'd really want to know what was the thought process, what was going on during that moment. Or one of the interesting things for me would be why Selim, Yavuz Sultan Selim, the father of Sulaiman al-Qanuni, the magnificent as in England, what was his thought process in feeling the need to conquer the Arab provinces? I mean, we have certain ideas, but we don't have any concrete evidence. And I would love to have been, I guess, a foot soldier, if you can call it that, during Fatih's conquest of Constantinople. That would have been really interesting to observe and read. And the sort of like points I've made to you about why I would want to be a fly on the wall in some of these moments is because, one, they're monumental moments in Ottoman history, but two, a lot of what we do in terms of historians is we still use our imagination to try to understand what happened because we weren't really there, right? And what we do is we use evidences to try to make sense of what happens. But actually physically being in a particular place or moment is totally different. So those moments would have, just to observe what the thought process was, would have really intrigued me.
Okay, that was a brilliant answer. For the second question I want to ask you is, what's the most surprising or unexpected discovery you've made during your research on the Ottoman history?
I think the most surprising thing is that I've learned that my opinions keep changing because you learn more and more as you go along. But my the most surprising thing I have found is not something about myself or about the Ottomans, but just how little Muslims know about Ottoman history. I think that's what's taken me aback a little bit. I mean, I understand it to some degree, but sometimes it upsets me when there's a level of anger, frustration, or hatred towards the Ottomans simply because this is our history. And I've learned to just embrace all of Islamic history, all warts and all. But also when I teach Ottoman history, especially when I started coming to the United States of America, and I just genuinely realized there is a desire to want to learn it, but really there is very little information or knowledge about it. And the knowledge about it is very rudimentary, which upsets me a little bit. So that's the main issue that I've come to learn, that while I'm always learning something new about Ottoman history and then, adjusting and evolving my positions and becoming more grounded. So one of the things you learn very quickly for anyone who does any form of ilm is the more you learn, the more you realize you knew very little. And that's one of the interesting things. And so in the early part of my career, when I was younger, there was probably a sense of hubris in my convictions regarding the historical past, in terms of me thinking that the opinion I held was the correct opinion. And as I've got older, I've started to realize that things can be a bit more complicated than that. And I've had to be a bit more humble in appreciating that if you're going to hold a absolute position, you better make sure that the position is absolute. in the sense that you better make sure that it's 100% watertight, because if there are any holes in that position, but you hold it absolutely, people will come and chop it down, and that's a very painful experience.
And that does remind me, the first time I met you, you were talking to us about how in classes you barely see any Muslims interested in Ottoman history. Why do you think that is?
There's multiple reasons for that. I mean, on a very basic and rudimentary level, most young Muslims are not interested in the humanities or history. There might not be any money on it in it. We are more interested in doing other vocations like the STEM subjects, which is science, technology, and maths, and so forth. We have family pressures, perhaps. The past feels like a very far away place. And so it really doesn't feel like it's something which is of interest to people. The Ottoman memory, as I've mentioned before, there's a particular collective amnesia. One of the reasons is because when the new nation states were formed, based from after the Ottomans, they sort of fashioned a idea of a decadent Ottoman past, an Ottoman past which was a little bit degenerate, perhaps. And so people want to remove that aspect of history from their memories. And then there are Muslims who have migrated to other parts of the world who don't necessarily live in the Muslim world, who really are not taught Islamic history in the way that it should be taught. And so they have no real interest in knowing that. I mean, most people would just be interested in the everyday now. So they would be interested in Drake and Kanye and Taylor Swift and whatever. But the idea that we should learn something about the past, about people that we really don't know, can be or can feel quite boring. So there's multiple reasons for that. And then that's accumulated in a way in which it's been, for me anyway, I would say it's created a deficiency in the Muslim collective memory in terms of how they identify in regards to what it means to belong to the Ummah.
Okay, that makes sense. If you could have dinner with any historical figure from the Ottoman Empire, who would it be and why? And what would you guys eat? What's your favorite Ottoman dish?
Hamid II, no doubt about it. I think Abdul Hamid II is probably the most controversial Ottoman ruler in the eyes of those who are not Muslim, but the most venerated sultan in the eyes who are Muslim. And for me, the emergence of Abdul Hamid in a time where there was much flux, much chaos, and yet he was still holding the empire together. It really fascinates me to some degree. And I was surprisingly, I went to a bookshop today, and I picked up a book of one of the aides of Abdul Hamid II. And as I was flicking through the contents page, this aide in his own biography, but talking about Abdul Hamid, mentioned what Abdul Hamid used to eat. And I just found it fascinating that he was mentioning that Abdul Hamid was a very simple man who enjoyed eating eggplant and eggs, right? And what's going on here? And so things like that, because it's, in some ways, he's a sultan who's so close, but in many ways, he's a sultan who's so far away. And for me, that would have been interesting. Apart from Abdul Hamid II, I probably would have been really interested in just meeting an average member of Ottoman society, like somebody who was part of the Janissary Corps. To try to make sense of what was going on there. So in that sense, if you're asking me in terms of a sultan, it's clearly Abdul Hamid II.
We've talked about Abdul Hamid II. We've also touched a bit about Mehmed. What if you could maybe highlight some lesser known figures in Ottoman history that you believe like deserve more recognition?
There's quite a few, but so the famous question in Turkey, it's a famous question in Turkey, is people always ask, you can get stopped by anyone. And when they notice you're a foreigner, especially someone like myself, when they ask me, oh, you study Ottoman and teach Ottoman history, who are your three favorite sultans? And the standard is people will go, Fatih, Suleiman, Abdul Hamid II. Everyone says that in this country. And I don't. I throw loops in there. I will go, oh, you know what? I'm really interested in Murat Hudavendigar. And they go, what? And then I go, yeah, and Bayezid Yildirim. And they go, what? And then I'll say, oh, and I really want to know about Genç Osman. And then these are the most obscure sultans you can think of. But I think for me, for example, Murat Hudavendigar, who was the third sultan or third leader of the Ottoman Empire. Hudavendigar, the name that was given to him was like the one who was chosen in that sense. And he was the one who fundamentally brought Islam into the Balkans, right? And he was killed at the Battle of Kosovo. And the way that he was killed at the Battle of Kosovo is the person who killed him, who was on the opposite armed forces, declared that he was Muslim. And by declaring he was Muslim, he got close to the Sultan and then was able to stab him in that sense and kill him. But Murad Hudavendigar's sort of like drive into the Balkans fundamentally creates the environment for the existence of the Janissary cause and the Devshirme system and Islam's presence in the Balkans as an Ottoman perspective. So that is somebody that I really find interesting in that sense. Genç Osman was a young Ottoman sultan who was the first sultan after Sultan Ahmed, who really he was the victim of a regicide, which was he was killed by the Janissaries for the first time. So in that sense, that was a huge shock to the system, that you have somebody here who was very young, came to power when he was about 14, 15, and then needed to prove himself and really couldn't. And the machinery turned on him in a way which is really sad. And that was one of the sadder moments in Ottoman history that I read. And it really upset me. And it was something that I thought, okay, people should know this story. And then finally, I mean, I mentioned Bayezid, but I do find Selim III interesting, Üçüncü Selim, they call him in Turkish, or he's known as the Mujaddid. And he was the first sultan who tried to implement reforms and to create a new army called the Nizam al-Jadid that would stand alongside the Janissaries. And in the end, it's interesting because the imagination was that he was the Mujaddid who was going to restore the Ottoman Empire, but in fact he was executed. Things got very messy. And there's a famous poem of his in which he mentions that this was the pen I gifted to the Sheikh al-Islam only for him to use it to sign the fatwa to permit my execution. And these sort of figures are very intriguing because they're complicated. But people very rarely read about or mention them. But if it was away from the big three, then those would be the ones.
I want to ask you, because nowadays we have like the horrible genocide that's happening in Gaza and Palestine in general. What was the role of Al-Aqsa and the land around it during the Ottoman period?
So the interesting thing about Islam in particular is that in Islam, we are integrationalists, which means that there is, in our culture, when Islam spread, it was a continued notion of integrating lands into each other and peoples into each other. And so when Aqsa became part of the Muslim world, as geographically part of the Muslim world in that sense, and Muslims had dominance over it, Aqsa was supposed to be integrated within the culture of Mecca and Medina, right? The three holy mosques of Islam in that sense. And so these were three specific, what you would call sacred spaces, spaces that belong to the Aqidah of Muslims in many ways. And it's very unique because if you think about it, no other civilization or religion has, in the way Islam has, these centers of these cities, these centers, where if they were destroyed, then there would be a huge issue regarding the religion itself. And for example, Makkah, Medina, and Aqsa are physically also a representation of Islam in that sense, right? And they need to be under Muslim protection. And so during the Ottoman period, what's interesting is when Fatih had conquered Constantinople, the conquest of Constantinople in many ways was represented as having some sort of like imaginations of Fath al-Makkah. But a lot of the imaginations later were designed to resemble the conquest of Aqsa in actuality. And there was a huge imagination of Aqsa and Hagia Sophia, this sort of like connection, an attempt to integrate the sort of like Aqsa question along with the Hagia Sophia question. And then when the Ottomans had conquered the Arab provinces, the Ottomans were very strict in their protection of Aqsa. and not just that, in the Ottoman mentality was the people in Aqsa are interconnected. You can't, they're inseparable, right? It is Islam and Aqsa that gave meaning to that land for the Ummah. And it is the Ummah who then became the bastions and vanguards and became attached to that land by giving it its history, culture, civilization, and so forth. And so in that sense, the two are inseparable. And you will see that in the mind of the Palestinian who lives in Beit al-Maqdis, they're well aware of that. For them, they are inseparable regarding that question. Now, the reason why I mentioned this to you is because in the contemporary discourse, when we talk about the politics in the West about the Palestinian and Israeli case, the Islamic component of the conversation is somewhat missing. And the Islamic component of Aqsa has been heavily integral to the Palestinian identity as a whole of every Palestinian, is somewhat removed. And the Aqsa is simply presented as a holy mosque. They sort of like secularize the idea of it. But Aqsa for us as Muslims is Aqidah. And in that sense, the Palestinian cause is not simply a cause of the killing of the Palestinians, but the de-Islamization of the Beit al-Maqdis, the attempts to remove road names, the attempts to destroy masajids, the attempts to destroy graveyards and history and so forth. This is an attempt of de-Islamization, which is to remove any remnant of Islam's presence there. So what you learn in that sense is that the Aqsa question from the time of prior to Rasul Sallam to the Isra and Miraj, to the conquest during the time of Umar bin Khattab, to the reconquest during the time of Salah ad-Din, to it being under the Ottoman authority for centuries, 400 centuries, has put layers and layers and layers of Islam's civilizational worldview consistently and continuously left a resemblance of the sacred, which is what we see that as, for both the people and Aqsa itself, and they are reflective of each other, right? And unfortunately, the last 75 years has continuously seen immense violence to the point that the respect of the sacredness of that area is clearly being violated, both in regards to the extreme killing and the attempts to strip that land away from its Islamic heritage.
I wanted to also ask you about, obviously the famous shows Ertugul, and now you have Osman. What do you think they do well, and what do you think like they get completely wrong about Ottoman history?
I mean, look, they're TV shows, right? And I think that's something that we have to take into consideration. So it's not, I mean, they're attempts to evoke some type of historical memory. And I think if I were to explain it to you this way, that both historians and fiction writers both require an imagination, right? And imagination is necessary. In that sense, as a historian, I still have to go into the past and try to help you understand what the past may be like in your mind. And so to some degree, what I do is I use my imagination to sort of explain to you about this historical past, so that on the one hand, you recognize that the past is a faraway place in the sense that it's very different than the world you live in right now. But in the same token, I want to explain to you that human beings are very similar in the things that they do, so it should resonate with you. So on the one hand, time has gone forward, so it is different, but on the other hand, it is quite the same in terms of our behaviors. Now, why is this important? Because I use my imagination to do it, but my imagination is restricted. It's restricted to the data set that is available to me, the evidence, right? Now, in fiction writing, the evidence is irrelevant. Fiction writers don't need to worry about the importance of the evidence or the validity of an evidence. Fundamentally, what they're interested in, if they're doing historical fiction in that sense, is just to try to help you understand the main idea, to help you understand the morals, the values, the general idea of what was taking place, but at the same time help you feel entertained, perhaps to some degree, so that you can learn something from that experience. And it is possible that sometimes you can say more truth in fiction than you can in reality, because there are many things that sometimes we are restricted from saying. Whereas if you're watching Star Wars, or you're watching The Mandalorian, or you're watching One Piece, or whatever it may be, that there can be ideas and themes you can put into these works of fiction that can resonate with people, and it can evoke a particular emotion. So both of them are valuable in that sense, but they have different functions in many ways. People often used to argue that the historian was the fiction writer of the field of academia, right, in that sense. But we are restricted to the evidence where the fictional writer isn't. And so as a result of that, the point I guess I'm making this long-winded answer is I don't mind it. I don't mind its existence. I don't mind the fact that it motivated so many people. I don't mind the fact that it was a particular form of entertainment. I don't mind the fact that it didn't always get the history correct and right, because history is an interpretative vocation anyway. Historians don't always agree on certain issues and points and milestones. But what it did do is it made people interested in history again. And I think that that was really important, that these shows have brought new audiences who want to learn history. And so what I feel is that these two vocations can coexist side by side. But if you were to ask me about the show, clearly I would tell you that a lot of it is made up. But that's okay. I don't have a problem with that. So long as people are aware that WWE is also not real, right? That it's a fictional piece of work. It doesn't need to be real, and and so forth. But if it encourages people to then want to learn what is real, I really don't have a problem with it.
I wanted to also ask you about you hear like stories in history all the time about how badly Muslims were treated, especially when they were forced, for example, out of Spain. I wanted to ask you how the Ottomans treated their non-Muslim companions in between their own walls. How was the coexistence between their different religious groups and different ethnic groups? How do they treat others, basically?
So I don't think we need to be defensive about the fact of making the case that in the Muslim world and in the Ottoman Empire, there was a differentiation between Muslims and non-Muslims. But the Ottomans, as a rule of thumb, across the board, by and large, were very careful to make sure that non-Muslims were not mistreated and lived a life of peace and tranquility within the Ottoman domains. And in fact, whenever there were at times contestations, confessional, as we call it, contestations amongst Muslims and non-Muslims in any particular area, the Ottoman government would come down hard on Muslims to make sure that they were not abusing non-Muslims. The Ottomans were well aware of the right of not abusing non-Muslims, primarily because the Ottomans were a minority. The Muslims were a minority in their own empire. And so when the Ottomans, for example, were advancing into the Balkans, one of the things the Ottomans were very careful of was not to enact in activities of forced conversion. They were against the idea of forced conversion. The Ottomans were very careful of not allowing Muslims to deliberately agitate non-Muslims by taking over their areas and gentrifying them and so forth. They made sure that Muslims lived outside. They were very careful in making sure that Muslims treated non-Muslims with the utmost respect in that sense. And they also allowed non-Muslims to regulate and live in accordance to their own religious laws and values and customs and cultures. And so the Ottomans were very careful about that. And one of the things I would want to stress is what you see in the 19th century in particular, is you will see many Jews in the Ottoman Empire were content and satisfied with living within the Ottoman Empire, then buying into the Zionist project. The Zionist project was a Western European project. It wasn't a project of Jews in the Ottoman world. They were content with living under Islam in that sense. And this is not just me as a Muslim trying to sugarcoat that. I mean, what you see is the way that non-Muslims lived under the Ottomans is very different than the way the British and the French treated Muslims in their colonies, right? They used them as slaves and so forth in that sense. And the Ottomans, I mean, not just because of the Ottomans, but because Islam in of itself, you know, fundamentally has come to, you know, to spread goodness. And so the idea that Muslims have a free hit to abuse non-Muslims is just not accepted in Islam. And the Ottomans were very careful about that. So this is why the Ottomans were able to, for so long, maintain their existence in the Balkans and parts of the Arab world, primarily because they didn't put boots on the ground. They didn't put a force for 400, 500, 600 years to stay there. Fundamentally, it came to a particular type of negotiation where the non-Muslim populations were kind of satisfied with the Ottomans in comparison to the earlier Christian states that existed before, that sometimes were more violent on their own people than the Muslims were.
What would you say is the prime time of Ottoman time period? Because I hear different answers. I want to know your opinion.
I mean, the standard answer of prime time is what you would say the period of Suleiman the Magnificent, right? Because this is when the Ottomans are at their highest sort of like landmass in that sense. But people don't realize that after the death of Suleiman, the Ottoman state is still expanded. It continues to expand beyond Suleiman in many ways. But the unfortunate thing is that our imagination of the Ottoman Empire has to some degree been shaped by Western thinkers who constructed the idea of calling Suleiman the Magnificent. And so in that sense, we've also brought into the idea that the pinnacle during the Ottoman period is the Suleimaniya period, but it is actually not in many ways. But I mean, it's hard to make comparison because one of the things we can say at least is that from the 18th century onwards, clearly the Ottomans are losing territory and so forth. And so they're not the same Ottoman Empire as the periods before, but then they're a very different empire in which they are an empire which has a different type of educational system, a different type of cultural system and so forth. And in some ways it looks quite different and was also equally interesting. But if we're going to go on a traditional trope, then it's the Suleimaniya period. But I personally, and maybe it's just because I'm a late Ottoman historian, do find the 19th century very interesting. Because in the 19th century, like we've heard these words like in the Arab world called the Nahda, which is a renaissance in Arabic culture and literature. And we see that type of renaissance taking place in Istanbul with Ottoman Turkish, Armenian, and even Ladino, which is what the script that the Jews used. And the 19th century, while was a moment of, you can say, geographical weakness in terms of the landmass the Ottomans had, but in terms of a intellectual sort of like cultural renaissance moment, something interesting was also happening, right? Now, there were a lot of challenges, don't get me wrong, coming from Western Europeans ideologically and politically, but nonetheless, there was a flourishing of ideas and like cross-fertilization of thoughts that I find very interesting in the latter period. That can give us a lot of answers today that we have forgotten about. There are a lot of things which Muslim thinkers sometimes talk about today, and I think to myself, that was already said in the 19th century, right? But we just don't read those works to realize that Muslims had said it before. And I think that that's an important moment to look into.
Of course, you have like two angles. You have like the side that they protected others' rights, so like they honored and respect that side of religion. But then you also hear that they had a lot of, they were superstitious, so like they believed.
Yeah. So the Ottomans, depending on what period and moment of Ottoman history you're looking at, I mean, Islam and from Sultan to periods, sort of like their understanding of Islam is dependent on the period that you're looking at. Fundamentally, the Ottomans were by and large a traditionalist, Hanafi, Sunni, Orthodox empire. But there is true that certain thoughts, ideas, and practices, which may sound and feel odd in today's day and age, were things that people did. So, and as a result of that, on various moments in Ottoman history, different Ottoman sultans leaned on Sufi movements for some sort of spiritual religious and political influence, perhaps. And that's something that people find strange, because that's something that never existed prior to the Ottomans. It is true that certain Ottoman sultans in particular believed in astronomy. And one of the things is because they were quite future orientated. And so they were always trying to anticipate the future. And this was a particular science that Muslims, not only in the Ottoman world, but around the Muslim world, have practiced in that sense. Now, some people, especially people who are practicing this, had no problem with that, whereas other Muslims critiqued it extensively by saying that this was a bid'ah. But it is true that certain Ottoman sultans did frequent in this practice and activity in that sense.
And the final question I have for you is, how do you unwind or relax when you're not immersed in academic pursuits?
I watch anime. So to be honest with you, there's very few hobbies that I have in that sense. When I was younger and fitter and healthier, I used to play football, what we call soccer in the UK, and so forth. And I played a lot of sports and so on. And I was a generation where computer games were just kicking in. So I was a generation that had a console, that played computer games to unwind and so forth. But I was also part of a generation where the mobile phone was not as intrusive in our lives as it is in yours. And so I travel a lot. I love to travel. I've traveled to so many countries. I've lived in Tokyo. I've lived in Malaysia. I've lived in Damascus. I've lived in Istanbul. I was born and raised in London. I've traveled extensively around Europe and part of the Far East and so forth. And I love doing that when I have time. But on the everyday wind, I like to escape. And one of the reasons why I guess I watch anime is because what I do in terms of history can be quite dense at times. And the brain just needs to escape. And to watch something which is easy to watch reminds me of my childhood to some degree. And in some ways is sophisticated storytelling. I really don't mind it. And so I really do like that. When I'm not doing that, I enjoy documentaries. And then I enjoy spending time with people. It sounds bizarre, but I really enjoy talking about Islam with people, mixing with people, having a laugh and a joke. People's company really makes me happy in that sense. And I think this is one of the beauties of Islam. Even though I'm an introvert, and my social battery can only take so much, but I do believe that when I spend time with people, to spend quality time with them. So yeah.
You support a Turkish team or an English team?
I support Liverpool, and I've supported Liverpool. Yeah. So I don't know if you can see on my wall, perhaps. There's Mohammed Salah is
Yeah, I see him. I see him. I
there.
think I see Steven Gerrard over there as well.
There's Steven Gerrard up
Yeah.
there. So I was a Liverpool supporter since a child. So this was before this. The Liverpool were an exciting team. When I was a kid, there was a footballer. His name was John Barnes, and you're not going to know who he is, but he
I've
was a
heard of
black,
him before though.
yeah,
Yeah.
he was a black footballer. And growing up as ethnic minorities, there were very few ethnic minorities, no Muslims playing football. So many of the Muslim kids, they became attached to John Barnes as somebody that was an ethnic minority who was an amazing footballer who played for Liverpool. And so I started supporting Liverpool, even though I'm not from the city of Liverpool. And then it stuck. Since then, my team has been up and down, but I prefer to support Liverpool over a national team. And in Turkey, I don't support a team at all. If I were to support another team outside of the UK, I can't think of one. I generally just like supporting teams that play attractive football. So long as they play attacking, attractive football, I'm all game. So in this European Championships right now, I'm really loving watching Turkey play because they're just chaos. Because you don't know if they're going to win or lose. They haven't got a clue what they're doing. But it makes watching soccer interesting. Whereas when I'm watching England, even though I'm from England, they are just so depressing that I just can't handle it. I'm like falling asleep watching the team that
You're not the only one. Trust me, you're definitely not the only one.
absolutely. So this is the thing. So in these tournaments, I just want to see it. I think now that I got older, I just love watching attractive football.
Agreed. Agreed. All right. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for taking time out of your day to do this. I really appreciate it, Doctor. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Okay.